Hi, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel. Today I'm thrilled that we are going to start our acrylic painting journey. I'll start by explaining what acrylic paints are, and then we'll talk about the materials needed to get started with your own acrylic painting practice. So, let's get started! Like any paint, acrylic paints are a binder and a pigment. And the binder for acrylic paints is plastic polymer. That means when the paint is exposed to air, it dries and hardens into solid plastic. What's nice about acrylic paints is they are relatively less toxic than their oil painting counterparts, and they have increased drying time. This allows us to work much more quickly on projects. However, it also can cause some challenges for the beginning artist. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about the materials you'll need to get started painting. We should start by discussing the elephant in the room, the paints themselves. Now, not all paints are created equal, so when you go to buy your first set of acrylic paints, you probably are wondering why they vary in price. Well, the cheaper the acrylic paints are, the more polymer and water is in the paint mixture, and the pigments might be less quality. Now, you can still paint with them, but what this means for you as the artist is that they might be a bit more sticky, tacky, and they will definitely be more translucent, but you can totally still work with them. In my own art practice, I use the Winsor Newton brand, and if I'm going for something a bit more expensive, I will use Golden. I prefer these acrylic paints just because they are considered heavy body, meaning they're much thicker, and they have quite a bit of good pigmentation in them. But again, it's all your own personal preference, and if you're just getting started, the cheap paints will do. When it comes to selecting colors, I suggest getting a set of warm and cool primaries plus black and white. I'm going to go ahead and list the color names specifically that I purchased next to me, and I'll also list them below in the description. With these sets of primaries plus black and white, you really can mix any color that you possibly want. And personally, in my own acrylic painting practice, I rarely touch anything other than the primaries and white. Occasionally, I'll touch burnt sienna or raw umber. However, you definitely do not need those to get started. Now that you know what kind of paints to buy, let's talk about brushes. In my own personal opinion, you do not need to buy expensive brushes. You can get a pre-selected brush pack or inexpensive brushes, and they will do just as well as the expensive ones. Now, the reason why artists will often suggest that you go ahead and buy expensive brushes is because occasionally with the cheap brushes, you will lose one or two bristles. This is because the ferrule, which holds the bristles to the brush and is that metal connection piece, isn't tight enough. And honestly, removing one or two hairs that might fall out really isn't a big deal to me. What's more important is what kind of brushes you have in your kit. And what I'm talking about is shape. The brushes I suggest having in your own personal starter kit is a filbert brush, a flat brush, and a round brush. And I suggest having these in two sizes, either medium small and a large, or a medium and a small brush. These are really the foundational brushes to any painting kit, and in a later video, I'll go over what each brush does. But for now, that's all you need to know. Next, you're going to want to have a container for water. This is going to be used for not only cleaning your brushes in, but also storing them in when you're not using them while you're painting. The fastest way to ruin a paintbrush is to leave it out in the air with acrylic paints on it, because then it will harden and turn into a plastic mass and it is ruined. There is no coming back. So by leaving it in the water, it prevents that from happening. The other thing you could do is clean the brush off entirely, and then you can store it away. Now for water containers, you can buy them at art stores. They're like plastic tubs, or you can use Tupperware. I've used old like plastic cups. I've used red Solo cups, really just anything that stores water. Continuing on with our water conversation, the other thing I highly suggest having is a spray bottle. Now, I use a Dollar Tree misting spray bottle, but you could also use just a regular spray bottle. Just make sure it's on the mist setting and not the jet setting. This allows us to keep our palettes wet and helps slow down the drying process while we are working with our paints. One of the major purchases as an artist is the palette, and I find it to be one of the more challenging purchases. This is because there is a variety of different palettes out there that are specific for different mediums. For acrylic paints, I suggest having a metal tray like this one, a glass palette, a glass tabletop. You can do the Cheap Trick palette, which is a picture frame with glass inside of it, or you can use palette paper or a paper plate. I would stay away from plastic palettes that have wells or dishes in them. This is extremely challenging to clean with acrylic paints, and they're also really unnecessary for mixing. You'll find that it is a lot easier to mix on a flat surface than it is to mix on a divided surface. And the other thing too is if you are working with a wood palette, I suggest getting palette paper that matches the size of your palette, because that wood will just absorb all of that moisture inside the paint and will make it really hard for you to clean it off. Now, if you are really gung-ho about acrylics but are worried about the drying time, optionally you could purchase a wet palette. A wet palette is a tray system in which there is a sponge in the bottom of the tray that is saturated with water, and then specialty paper that is laid over the top, also saturated with water. This creates a damp environment for your acrylic paints and greatly extends their longevity. Now, I personally have a wet palette, and I've only had it for about a year or so, and I will say I do still tend to reach for my other palettes first. But I will say my wet palette is very nice, so it's definitely an option if you are considering painting with acrylic paints. My only other optional suggestion is to get a cheap tabletop easel or standing easel. Now, you definitely don't need an easel to start painting with acrylic paints. I certainly didn't when I started. However, I will say that painting with an easel is a lot easier than painting on a table surface. But if it's outside of your means, you certainly don't need to purchase one. Last but certainly not least is the surface that you'll be painting on. If you are a beginner, I suggest working on a canvas panel. Or if you already have pre-stretched canvas at home, go ahead and use that. Alternatively, you could use a canvas pad, which looks exactly like a pad of paper. However, it has pre-gessoed canvas inside. My only suggestion is to tape it down before you start working on it. And speaking of paper, I would try to stay away from it as much as possible, as it absorbs a lot of the moisture out of the paint and can be really challenging to work with. Later in this series, I will talk about what each canvas does, and I'll also talk about how you can work on other surfaces like paper and wood. But for today, these are all the materials you need to get started with acrylic paints. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them as they come up. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Or if you'd like to see more art education videos or stuff from my own practice, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Again, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.